Welcome, listener, to this nighttime journey through time. Today we invite you to travel to the world of the Vikings, an era of brutal raids, harsh seas, and the never-ending struggle for survival. But don't rush, don't rush. Take a moment to get comfortable, close your eyes, and imagine that you are in that very world. Imagine waking up at dawn in a small Viking settlement surrounded by cold seas and mountain peaks. At first glance, life seems calm, children playing around the campfire, adults preparing for the day in the fields or in the workshop. But did you know that just over the horizon, in the murky waters of the North Sea, lurk those who will destroy this world? Everything you knew about your home, your life, can be destroyed in the blink of an eye. Vikings are a feared people, whose names echo through the centuries. They do not come in peace, and their raids are not just acts of violence. They are what changed the fate of entire villages, nations, even entire continents. This is a world where every day could be your last. Imagine lying in your bed at night, with silence enveloping you, when suddenly, in the distance, very quietly, you hear drums. Gradually, their sound becomes louder and clearer, reaching your consciousness, and you understand that this is not just an ordinary sound. Vikings are approaching, and in this world full of unknown horrors, you feel your heart beat faster. This could be the end. And so you find yourself in a world where danger comes not only from enemies, but also from nature itself, with storms, cold, and terrible loneliness. The life of the Vikings was a continuous struggle, both on the battlefield and in everyday life. These tough people lived with a constant sense of threat, and their victories were not always as bright and joyful as we are taught in legends. We will explore their real life, cruel and difficult, but one that was full of strength, determination, and self-sacrifice. Take your time, immerse yourself in this time, feel the weight of its reality, but also its beauty. A world where every day began with a fight, and every moment was filled with meaning. Try to imagine how this life would feel, not from books, not from myths, but through details. Viking life was not only about bloody battles, but also about resilience, about survival, about everyday life that could be as terrible as the raids themselves. After all, every day was a fight for survival. This is not a thrill ride in the traditional sense. We will not be running for thrills, but instead will be delving into the details, slowly and calmly learning every aspect of Viking life, understanding them not through legends and myths, but through their real experiences and struggles. So, close your eyes, let your mind drift into this world. Now that we are in the atmosphere, imagine the weather changing, not just a cold wind, but a threat. We are going to go into the thick of things, to that moment when life, which seemed calm, was in fact only a fleeting illusion. Now is the time to imagine how you would experience a Viking raid. Did you feel the cold, their determination, the fear that fills the air? It is all coming, and we continue, diving into this reality. Imagine waking up at night. The world around you is shrouded in fog, and the night quietly fills the air with its cold. The Viking settlement you live in seems peaceful. You know every corner of this small settlement. Here, in the shadow of a high mountain, your home is not just a place to sleep. It is your fortress, your protection. But you do not know that perhaps even now, in the darkness, danger is lurking. This night could be your last. You feel a slight movement of air, a light, barely noticeable breeze that brings with it smells. The smell of pine needles, damp earth, maybe even smoke from a fire. The air is fresh and a little cold, as if just before dawn. Nothing unusual, it seems. The night is like any other night. The children are asleep, tucked under warm blankets, and the spouses are also resting after a hard day of work in the fields. But suddenly, this moment of calm is broken by a strange sensation. The silence seems to become too thick, too palpable. Time slows down. Your ears begin to listen, sensing something that was barely noticeable before. And now, there, in the depths of the night, you suddenly hear it. At first, a barely perceptible sound. Everything seems far away, but not so far that it could be just your imagination. The sound of drums. The drums are not loud, not harsh, but they sound with some inexplicable heaviness. Rhythmic beats that vibrate the air pass through your chest, giving a slight tension in your temples. At first, it is just a sound, but then its rhythm becomes more and more clear. The drums sound louder and louder, and with each beat, the anxiety in your heart grows. The night gradually loses its usual silence. The The light wind increases. It brings with it the smell of fresh sea salt, dry moisture, the smell of rain and old wood. And now, without any doubt, you begin to realize that this is not just an unknown creature. This is not just a random sound. This is a harbinger of something much more terrible. Now that you hear that sound clearly, that it becomes real, you have to do something you don't want to do. Drums. They always foretell something terrible. Vikings. The Vikings are coming. The horror you felt when you realized what was really happening, no one will ever forget it. Imagine your thoughts racing. You're standing in your home, your heart pounding in your chest. Is this possible? The Vikings. They're coming. Their ships are already approaching. Their long boats, black and sleek as cats, glide through the water. They make almost no sound, but you hear them. They're coming to fight, to destroy. And now it's clear to you. You can't run, and you don't have time to prepare. You start hurriedly waking your family. But even as you run through the house, panicked, it feels unreal. Why are you only now realizing that they are so close? The Vikings. Their numbers, their determination. Your home is just a tiny dot on the map. And what's even more frightening is that the Vikings aren't coming just to pillage. They're coming to destroy. And now you can hear the wooden ships sliding across the water. There is something special in this moment, in the air. The sounds are not just the popping of cheerful lights. This is not just noise in the middle of the night. This is a sign. A battle is coming. You feel your heart beating faster. Your house suddenly becomes very cold, colder than before. The Vikings are close, and their approach is felt on an instinctive level. At that moment, when you see your loved ones trying to gather themselves, someone running to the cellar, someone rushing for a gun, you understand that none of these things will help you. It's too late. You won't be able to save yourself. You look into the eyes of your children and understand there is no time to think about what to do next. This is the end. And here they are, the Vikings. They have arrived. You hear the roar and the shrieks and the screams. Their axes and swords glitter in the first light that breaks through the dark sky. And then you realize that facing this enemy is not just unbearable. It is consuming everything around you. You are losing your homes, your memories, your dreams. But you are not just losing. You are standing on the edge of this cataclysmic event, like a silent witness. You did not survive. This brutal reality was real to every person who stood in their path at that moment. Their goal was not only destruction, their goal was survival and conquest. Vikings are not just killers, they are survivors who know the price of cruelty, and most importantly, they know how to become part of that very cruel reality. These are not just cruel people with axes. This is a thirst for destruction that goes through the centuries. Now, as you feel the air around you grow tense and dark, imagine what happens next. The silence returns. But it's not the same as before. It's total. All that's left of your settlement are burning ruins and smoke. And you realize that this horror, this moment of fear, will haunt you long after the Vikings are gone. As hard as it was, Viking life wasn't just about raiding. It was about the hard work, the daily grind, the people who lived, fought, and survived. It wasn't just about brutality, but also a deep awareness of how hard it was to survive in a world where every day could be your last. Now that the wind has died down, you can still feel its cold breath piercing you. But it's time to move on from this horror, from the battle. This is not the end of the story. This is just the beginning of the journey. We go deeper into the world of the Vikings to understand how they lived, as commoners, as warriors, and as kings. And although their lives were brutal, they were not without moments of life. When we think of Vikings, we mostly think of bloody battles, brutal raids, and knights in armor wielding axes and swords. But in the real life of a Viking, between the raids and battles, there was an everyday life full of hardship, survival, and determination. The real life of a Viking was much more varied and complex than we are led to believe through legends. These men, who became famous for their brutal raids and conquests, also had to take care of their families, their home, the land they lived on, and their heritage. Now that you have closed your eyes and feel the space around you becoming warm and cozy, imagine yourself in this distant past. Imagine that you are a Viking living in your small house, which barely stands on the rocky shores of Scandinavia. Winter is approaching, and the cold penetrates every crack in your home, but you are used to it. In this harsh climate, there is no room for weakness, and each day requires full dedication and perseverance. A Viking is not only a warrior, he is also a builder, a farmer, a craftsman, and a hunter. His hands are accustomed to hard work. Waking at dawn, you feel yourself being pulled out from under the warm blanket, carefully, into the air where the cold of the night is still in the air. The house is full of sounds, the crackling of the fire in the hearth, the slight creak of the wood from a gust of wind, the light breathing of your loved ones who have not yet awakened. The faint smell of smoke mingles with the smell of damp stones and wood. It is early morning, but it is filled with action. You walk into the kitchen to prepare food for your family. The outside world is still in shadow, but the first rays of light are beginning to emerge in your home. You light a fire in the hearth, warming your hands and casting a dim, pleasant light into the room. Today's breakfast is oats, honey, and some fish, perhaps caught in the river yesterday. The water on the fire begins to boil, making a melodic, soothing sound. Breakfast in the morning is more than just a meal. It is a ritual, a moment of calm before another day of struggling to survive begins. A Viking does not have the luxury of rest. There is always something in the life of these people that requires their attention. Every morning is a struggle for food, for keeping the house in order, for keeping your supplies safe. After breakfast, you take your time. This is the time for small but important tasks. Collecting firewood, cleaning weapons, checking the ropes and cables for the boat that may be needed on the journey, working in the garden or in the field, repairing tools. This is the real life of a Viking, a life where every gesture, every detail, every action matters. After working in the fields, there comes a time when the Viking can sit down and rest, but the rest is not long. He knows that he cannot relax. Winter will soon come, and his family will depend on him preparing for the cold. Behind this moment of peace lies tension. He has no time to forget about the future. He is tired already. But if he does not prepare now, winter will be a real challenge. The Viking will often spend his nights preparing food, preparing spare equipment, or making repairs. The life of a Viking is not just the life of a hunter or a warrior, but also the life of a family. Vikings take care of their relatives, children, wives, old people, because they are all connected by invisible threads of duty. No matter how cruel they may seem on the battlefield, in their family they can be gentle and caring. But even in the family they have to fight for survival. Nature does not forgive the weak. The vast areas they cultivate require not only physical strength, but also the ability to manage the land, understanding its cycle, ensuring that the harvest is as fruitful as possible. The Vikings grew crops such as barley, oats, wheat, and also kept livestock, goats, sheep, and cows. This process, as simple as it may seem, was not so easy. After all, every year the land had to rest, and the plants had to be grown in harsh northern conditions. The day was drawing to a close when, after all the work, the night came. The house was silent, and the whole world outside the hut was swallowed up by the dark night. But there was something calming about it. The Viking knew that in life there was a place for rest. It was not a rest from fear, but a rest from endless work. In the evening, the neighbors came, feasts were held, songs were sung, stories were told. It was a time to forget, to immerse oneself in the atmosphere of community, and to strengthen ties with relatives and neighbors. Viking holidays, despite their severity, were full of joy, fun, and warmth. For the hard work in the fields and at home, Vikings usually found time to relax and socialize. They had long dinners, sang old songs, swapping stories of past exploits. It was their time to forget and recuperate. But even in such moments of joy and happiness, they could not get rid of the understanding that at any moment they would have to return to war. In the life of a Viking, there was no sense of security as we are accustomed to. Life was filled with the constant expectation that war could come at any moment. And in this everyday life, between work and fun, between battles and rest, lay the secret of their survival. The Vikings were not only warriors, they were people who faced the harsh conditions of their lives every day and overcame them. Despite everything they lost, they knew how to live, and they knew how to survive. Now that we have moved into the darkness and chaos of the Viking raid, it is time to move into a more mysterious corner of Viking history. The world of these people was full of secrets and untold stories that remain enigmas even today. The Vikings, as we know, were not only destroyers, but also explorers, sailors, traders, and pioneers. One of the greatest, yet still unsolved mysteries of their culture is the disappearance of their ships. Those majestic vessels that carried them through stormy waters, helped them conquer new lands and make long voyages around the world. Imagine the world of the Vikings, their legendary ships that pierced the fog, their sharp prows pointing out to sea, ready for battle. These ships, like dragons, with their dark skulls on the prow, carried mystique and power. They were skillfully built to withstand any challenge, be it a storm at sea or a battle on land. But what happened to these ships when the Viking Age began to fade? Why can't they be found? Why did they disappear? This is not just an idle question. It is the key to understanding what was happening to this great people, to their culture and heritage. The Vikings were sailors whose ships were their main tool. They sailed their longships across the open sea, covering vast distances, in search of new lands, new opportunities, and riches. These ships were symbols of their power, and their seafaring abilities were truly impressive. They were the first to reach the coast of North America, long before Columbus thought of discovering the New World. They penetrated the most remote corners of Europe, established trade relations with the Arabs, the Slavs, and even the Chinese. And for them, the sea was not just an obstacle, it was a path to new horizons. But it is worth thinking, where are all these ships? Where are those long ships that the Vikings used for their campaigns? We know that the Vikings used their ships for peaceful purposes, for trade, for exploring new lands, and not just for attacks and destruction. On these ships they transported goods, jewelry, and also their culture. But at some point, these ships disappeared. Sailors and explorers from the earliest times have tried to solve this mystery, trying to find traces of the Vikings, their ships, and settlements. But why did these great ships disappear? We know that the Vikings were not solitary conquerors. They probably could not simply abandon their ships and disappear into the shadows of history. Perhaps their ships were swallowed by the ocean, its stormy waters, rocks, storms that, like merciless ghosts, swallowed everything in their path. But when researchers began searching for these lost ships, they were faced with another mystery. Where could they be? Do these sunken vessels exist, hidden beneath the water? Archaeologists are certain that such ships must be out there somewhere, perhaps hidden in glaciers washed by coastal waters, or buried in the sand that has accumulated over the centuries in places where once stood vibrant Viking settlements. But something is preventing them from being found, something that remains beyond the reach of modern technology. There is a theory that many of the ships may have been destroyed during raids, swallowed up by storms, or simply abandoned by the Vikings when they decided that their era had come to an end. As the Vikings began to settle in new lands, they may have begun to lose interest in the very ships that led them to conquest. Some historians believe that their fleet was destroyed, not just by natural forces, but deliberately, so as not to leave a trace, to prevent enemies from using these powerful ships. We also can't forget that the Vikings often used their ships for peaceful purposes. They weren't just ships for destruction. These ships were used to help merchants transport goods, from silk and spices to jewelry and weapons. And what if the Vikings realized that as trade developed, they didn't need ships like they did in battle? They may have switched to smaller, more maneuverable ships, leading to the disappearance of the large longships that were symbols of their era. But despite all these theories and studies, we can find no clear answer. The mystery of the loss of the Viking ships remains unsolved, like so much else in this fascinating but often brutal story. Perhaps this is the greatness of the Vikings, that they left behind many secrets and legends, but without a single clear reason for their disappearance. They were like their ships, fast, powerful, and elusive, vanishing into distant waters, leaving behind only footprints in the sand that fade with each passing year. Imagine this moment, a long search, expeditions for years, but no concrete results. It becomes a symbol of everything that surrounds us in the history of the Vikings. They were people who left a great legacy, but never told us their whole story. Maybe this is another of those mysteries that will always be hidden, but will continue to entice us with their legends and the possibility of discovering new facts. We can only guess what might have been if we could find these lost ships, find out where they are hidden and what they can tell us. Now that we have looked into the daily lives of the Vikings and discovered the secrets that have been lost to time, it is time to focus on those who led these people to greatness. The Viking kings are figures surrounded by myths, legends, and incredible stories that greatly shaped the society and destiny of Scandinavia. However, beneath the surface of glory and power, there was an endless struggle for power, intrigue, and betrayal that was an integral part of their world. These kings and warriors were both heroes and tragic figures, not only in battle, but also in their personal life dramas. Picture yourself standing on a high hill in Scandinavia, surrounded by looming mountain ranges that reach up to the clouds, and in the distance, in the vastness of the lands your people have conquered. Before you is a mighty army, your legacy, the fruit of your efforts, cruel and merciless, to consolidate your power and control over these lands. A Viking king ruling over his people, surrounded by castles, military might, but also a constant sense of threat and betrayal, stands before you, looking back on the results of his reign. His whole life has been like a struggle with his own demons. The life of a Viking king was dangerous, but it was not always filled with fighting external enemies. The political struggle within his kingdom was no less dangerous. Viking kings could not afford to relax even for a moment, since at any moment their power could be challenged by their own warriors, family, or neighboring rulers. These cruel and pragmatic people understood that power is not something that can be held for life. Power required constant readiness for struggle and dedication, as well as the ability to manipulate allies and enemies. An example of such a king was Harald Bluetooth, one of the most famous rulers of Scandinavia, who became the king of Denmark and Norway. He became a symbol of strength and ambition, but behind his power was a long and ongoing struggle for power, which included not only wars, but also political manipulation, diplomatic deals, and, of course, betrayal. In Harald's life, the struggle for the throne was not a smooth road. He faced many enemies, including his own relatives, and was forced to fight for his crown not only with external enemies, but also with those who were close to him. The war was not only fought on the battlefield, but also in the halls of the royal palaces, where intrigue and danger lurked at every turn. Harald, like other great rulers of his time, knew that he had to make sacrifices to stay on the throne. His reign was full of tragedy and sacrifice, and there was a cold logic to his decisions. He sacrificed close allies for his own safety, which later came back to haunt him. This brutal struggle for power cost him dearly, including the support of those who had once been his closest friends. The next example was Ragnar Lothbrok, a legendary Viking whose life was also turbulent and full of power struggles. Ragnar became the hero of many sagas, and his name became a symbol of bravery and fearlessness. He was a truly great warrior who not only conquered new lands, but also strengthened his dynasty. His name became associated with the power and greatness of the Vikings, but in reality, behind his successes, there were numerous tragedies and betrayals. Ragnar was a man whose success on the battlefield was associated with personal sacrifices, including betrayals from his closest allies and even family members. One of the most dramatic events in Ragnar's life was his downfall. After being captured by his enemies, he was thrown into a pit of snakes, symbolizing his tragic fate. It was the end of one of the most majestic Viking rulers, but also the beginning of a new era. Ragnar's sons continued his work, but despite the glory of his name, their lives were also full of struggle and betrayal. What began as a desire for greatness became a heavy burden that was passed down from generation to generation. Intrigue and betrayal became an integral part of the life of a Viking king. At any moment, the person you hoped to be on your side could turn against you. This constant fear and tension had a significant impact on the psychological state of the kings. The Vikings lived with the idea that any of their enemies could be within their own circle. A life filled with struggle was also associated with personal isolation and the need to constantly monitor their allies. The psychological burden on the king was enormous, as he had to take care not only of his army, but also of his entourage, which could suddenly change. No matter how many victories a Viking had, he was always looking for security for his dynasty, for his people, for his family. He was not only a warrior, but also a strategist who had to manipulate various forces every day to maintain his power. But despite all their efforts, these great rulers could not avoid that their power would eventually be destroyed. Their dynasties fell, and their legacy remained only in memories. These Viking kings, despite their cruelty and determination, left behind not only the marks of war, but also profound reflections on strength, power, and responsibility. Their lives were full of tragedies, but also great victories. The history of the Viking kings is not just a chronicle of glorious battles. It is also a chronicle of sacrifice and lost hopes. Their legacy reminds us how difficult it is to hold on to power, and how easy it is to lose it, even if you are a king. The myth of the Vikings as purely destructive conquerors often obscures their more complex role in history. The Vikings, despite their reputation as fierce warriors, were also skilled traders and explorers whose travels and trade routes spanned much of the world, from Europe to Asia and even North America. Their activities were not limited to raids and conquests, but also included diplomacy, trade, cultural exchange, and exploration. Importantly, the Vikings not only discovered new territories, but also adapted to new conditions, with surprising ease and integrated different cultures into their lives. The Viking trade network was one of the most extensive and sophisticated in the Middle Ages. Viking traders linked Scandinavia with distant parts of Europe, Asia, and even the Middle East. These seafarers not only plundered coastal settlements, but also established long-term trade relationships that were beneficial to both sides. One such example is the development of trade links between the Vikings and the Arabs. Arab merchants and the Vikings exchanged goods such as silk, spices, and jewelry. Through trade with the Arabs, the Vikings gained access to luxury goods that were not available in Europe, including silk and glassware. The trade routes that the Vikings traveled stretched across the Baltic Sea, Poland, Russia, and further to the territory of the Byzantine Empire and the Arab states. One of the most famous trade routes was the route from Scandinavia to Byzantium through Rus. It was the Vikings, also called Varangians in the Russian lands, who played an important role in creating the first trade and political ties between Eastern Europe and Byzantium. Many of them, being craftsmen and merchants, not only fought but also engaged in peaceful activities, creating and maintaining complex trade networks. The Vikings used their ships to transport goods, furs, weapons, jewelry, slaves, and even loans. Trade with the Middle East and Arab countries was one of the most important components of Viking trade. Many Viking expeditions to this region were aimed at finding precious metals, as well as exchanging goods that were unknown in Europe. The Vikings exchanged their goods, such as furs, amber, and slaves, for luxurious Arab products, silk, glass, spices, and various exotic goods. During their travels along the rivers of Eastern Europe and across the Caspian Sea, the Vikings not only engaged in military action, but also actively engaged in trade. The Vikings interacted with the Arabs on many levels, including trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchanges. This interaction played an important role in the development of both the Vikings and Arab civilization, and further influenced the cultural exchange between the West and the East. Although many associate the discovery of America with Columbus, the Vikings were the first Europeans to set foot on the American continent long before him. Viking Leif Erikson, son of the famous explorer Eric the Red, arrived in what is now northwestern Canada around the year 1000, where he founded a settlement he called Vinland. This is considered one of the first European contacts with North America, almost 500 years before Columbus. The Vikings used their long, fast ships for long voyages, and their ability to navigate the sea and cross long distances played a key role in these discoveries. Even though the Viking settlement in Vinland proved to be fragile and unsuccessful due to climate conditions and possible conflicts with local peoples, their voyages through North American waters remain outstanding examples of their seafaring skills. One of the most important aspects of Viking trade was the influence they had on other cultures and vice versa. The Vikings actively adopted the skills and technologies they encountered along the way. In the course of trade and diplomatic missions, they adopted elements from other peoples, such as new shipbuilding technologies, agricultural methods, and various cultural and religious practices. In turn, their cultural influence was also significant, especially in the territories they conquered or established trade relations with. We must not forget about the exploration activities of the Vikings. They not only opened new trade routes, but also actively explored unknown territories. The Vikings crossed vast expanses of oceans, explored distant lands such as Iceland, Greenland, and perhaps even North America. Their explorations and campaigns became the basis for many future discoveries and expeditions that changed the map of the world. They also developed their geographical knowledge. Their cartographic achievements, although not as detailed as those of later explorers, allowed them to navigate the ocean and reach distant lands. This was especially important in an era when most Europeans could not afford such long voyages. Trade and exploration were an integral part of Viking culture and contributed greatly to their success and prosperity. These great seafarers and traders created a network of routes that linked distant corners of the world, from Europe to Asia, the Middle East, and even North America. Despite their reputation as destructive warriors, the Vikings were no less skilled and diplomatic. With a culture based on the exchange of knowledge and goods, the Vikings did more than conquer. They built bridges between worlds, establishing long-lasting trade and cultural ties that have influenced the course of world history. When we think of Vikings, most of us tend to think of them as fearless warriors fighting on the battlefield and conquering lands. However, few people pay attention to the great role of women in their society. Although the Vikings were indeed known for their warlike nature, women in this society played an important and active role. Their lives and place in the social structure were very different from the traditional idea of women in other cultures of the time. Viking women were not just keepers of the hearth, they were also housewives, warriors, and even chieftains. Their lives were full of determination, independence, and strength, which makes them extremely important figures in Viking history. Women in Viking society were not just mothers and wives whose role was limited to domestic duties. On the contrary, they were important members of their society, actively participating in its development. A Viking woman, like her husband, could take part in important matters such as housekeeping, farming, handicrafts, and also in military actions if necessary. One of the most striking examples of the female role in Viking society is the image of the Viking woman housewife, managing a large house and the entire family economy. Vikings often went on long campaigns, and women stayed at home to manage affairs. Women managed the land, organized production, took care of livestock, organized agriculture and trade. This was not just fulfilling duties, it required serious management and organizational skills. There were also some true warriors among the Viking women. Although such examples were rare, they certainly existed. Women could fight if their lands were attacked or if their husbands and sons were away on long expeditions. The Valkyrie saga speaks of women who were not only warriors, but also goddesses who protected warriors in battle. These myths and sagas may serve as a metaphor for real women who fought for their lands and families. There are a number of historical accounts of women fighting in the Viking ranks, and some even held high military positions. The most striking example of a warrior Viking woman is Lagertha, a character in the sagas, who was a famous Amazon who fought alongside men. According to the sagas, she became the wife of the famous Viking Ragnar Lothbrok, and was herself a leader of warriors who defended their land. This shows that Viking women were not simply limited to the role of supportive members of society, but could be leaders and battle girlfriends for their husbands. The sagas and myths that were the foundation of Viking culture are not only literary works, but also sources of important historical information. Women play an important role in these stories, and their images often go beyond traditional female roles. In the Valkyrie saga, the role of women as protectors and leaders of the warrior reaches its climax. The Valkyries are mythical creatures who chose which warriors would die on the battlefield and which would go to Valhalla, Odin's palace, where they would prepare for the final battle. These myths not only personified the importance of women in warfare, but also reflected the role of women as guardians of fate. In addition to mythological images, the saga also contains real examples of strong women, such as Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility, who was also closely associated with war. Her image was multi-valued. On the one hand, she symbolized passion and care for the family. On the other, her strength and power in battle became an integral part of Viking mythology. Gudrun from the Gudrun saga and her tragic story is another example of a woman becoming the central figure in a myth. She experiences many tragedies, from the loss of husbands to family betrayals. However, she shows unbending strength in the face of adversity and shows that a woman can not only survive, but also maintain her dignity and honor in the most difficult circumstances. Such stories personified the qualities that were highly valued by the Vikings: determination, fortitude, and the pursuit of truth. The Vikings were known for their chieftaincy system, where power and leadership were passed down through the male line. However, despite this, women played an important role in Viking politics and leadership. Women were influential figures in their communities, and could take part in important decisions related to the management of lands and families. They could even influence military decisions. The political life of the Vikings was also influenced by the women, who were the wives of chieftains and kings. They helped their husbands in organizing campaigns, in diplomatic negotiations, and in managing the territory. Sometimes women themselves became rulers if, due to some circumstances, they remained the sole heirs of the land. The story of Sigurd the Magnificent, a woman who influenced the political life of Scandinavia, is a clear example of this. She was an influential woman who, despite her role as a wife and mother, was able to manage land holdings and influence political processes. There are also many accounts of women playing key roles in military and political alliances. For example, Hild, the wife of a Viking chieftain, was not only her husband's ally, but also, in a sense, his partner in solving important political and military issues. This does not mean that Viking women were officially recognized as rulers, but their influence was much more significant than it seems at first glance. The Vikings also recognized the power of women in clan traditions. Sometimes women were the ones who supported the community in difficult times, whether in slaughter, in deciding on foreign policy, or in protecting their loved ones. Their participation in public life, as well as their military skills, served as an example for the entire community. And although women did not always hold official positions, their role in social, political, and military life was invaluable. Viking women were not passive members of society, whose role was limited to home and family. On the contrary, they were active participants in the life of their people, acting as housewives, warriors, leaders, and even rulers. Vikings respected the strength of a woman, her ability to manage a home and community, her determination in battle, and her ability to lead others. Women in sagas and myths embodied not only femininity, but also strength, fortitude, and determination. Although Viking women were not always official rulers, their influence on social and political life was significant. Thanks to these women, the Vikings were able to survive and thrive, coping with the challenges of their era. The influence of Viking women on culture, social structures, and political leadership remains an important aspect in understanding this mysterious and multi-layered civilization. Viking women were not just keepers of the hearth, but true heroes of their time, whose names and deeds continue to inspire today. The Vikings, like many other ancient peoples, were deeply religious people. Their belief system was closely linked to nature, war, life, and death. Viking mythology was one of the richest and most multi-layered, filled with many gods, myths, and sacred rituals. Their pantheon was not just a collection of deities, but an important element of their culture and social life. The Vikings believed that the gods intervened in the daily lives of people, and that the destinies of people and gods were intertwined in an endless cycle of existence. The basis of the Vikings' religious beliefs was their pantheon of gods, and the most important of these was Odin, the supreme god of the Vikings, the god of wisdom, poetry, war, and death. Odin was a god who sought knowledge throughout his life, even if it meant sacrificing something important. He sacrificed one of his eyes to gain knowledge of the runes, and was willing to make any sacrifice to understand the hidden laws of the world. The saga of his travels often describes how Odin and his companions interact with people, set rules, and even interfere with the destinies of people, forcing them to take part in great battles or to be victims of certain events. Thor, the son of Odin, was perhaps the most revered god among the Vikings, a symbol of strength, courage, and protection. Thor was the god of thunder and lightning, often depicted with the hammer Mjolnir, which was his main weapon. Thor's lightning was used by the Vikings to explain thunderstorms and storms. Thor was the protector of mankind and a deity who personified earthly strength and brutal male power. Myths about Thor often describe his battles with giants and his struggle to maintain order in the world. Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and magic, also held an important place in the pantheon. She was associated with fertility, love affairs, and said magic, the practice of divination and manipulation of reality. Freya was a goddess who protected the home, family, and reproduction, but she also had martial qualities. She was one of the most influential figures in Viking mythology, as she led the Valkyries and accepted worthy warriors into Valhalla, where they would spend their afterlife awaiting Ragnarok, the end of the world. Besides these three great figures, there were many other gods and deities in the Viking pantheon, such as Loki, the god of deception and cunning, Baldur, the god of beauty and goodness, who was killed by his brother Loki, Freyr, the god of fertility and peace, Hel, the goddess of the underworld, and many others. These gods and deities ruled over various aspects of life, death, war, and nature. Sagas, myths, and epics played a key role in Viking culture, shaping moral values and a way of life. These historical and mythological stories not only served as entertainment, but were also a way of passing on knowledge and experience from generation to generation. Vikings told stories of their gods, heroes, great battles, and journeys, preserving in them the wisdom of their ancestors and the teachings that served as the basis for their existence. Sagas were important texts of Viking literature, often telling of real events such as military campaigns, rapes, and dynastic wars, but also interwoven with myths and legends. Some of these sagas serve as historical sources, allowing researchers to see how the Vikings perceived their campaigns and the events of their era. They showed the great value of honor, courage, loyalty, and devotion. However, the sagas also often depicted gods and myths as part of the real world, where the forces that determine the fate of people are active and intervene in every event. One of the most important myths for the Vikings was the myth of Ragnarok, the end of the world, a great battle where all the gods and heroes fight the forces of chaos. This myth predicted the destruction of the world order and a return to the original chaos, after which the world would be created anew. It was not only a prophecy, but also a lesson that life and death are intertwined in an eternal cycle, and that heroes must fight to the end, despite the inevitability of their death. Myths about gods such as Thor, Odin, and Freya reflected the most important aspects of Viking life: the desire for strength, respect for wisdom, the value of courage in battle, and the importance of magic and religious practices. These myths and sagas taught the Vikings about fighting, loyalty, and the importance of family honor. They helped them determine how to conduct themselves in life and how to relate to fate. The Vikings were pagans, and their religious practices and rituals were an integral part of their daily lives. One of the most important aspects of Viking paganism was sacrifice. They believed that sacrifices to the gods helped strengthen their connection with the spirit world, as well as ensure good luck in battle and success in business. Sacrifices could be very diverse, from animal sacrifices, horses, cows, sheep, to human sacrifices. The Vikings believed that the blood spilled in these rituals strengthened the divine powers and protected them from disasters. Sacred places also played an important role in the religious life of the Vikings. They often performed their rituals in places of worship that were dedicated to the gods. One such place was the Uppsala Temple in Sweden, where the Vikings gathered to perform annual rituals and sacrifices. This place was associated with the power and majesty of the gods, and many Vikings sought to get there to worship and receive blessings. In addition, the Valkyries, mythical women who were associated with the god Odin, played an important role in the religious life of the Vikings. They collected fallen heroes and led them to Valhalla, where they continued to prepare for the final battle at Ragnarok. The Valkyries represented strength and destiny, and many Vikings sought the honor of joining their ranks. In addition to rituals, magic was an important part of Viking pagan practice, especially scythe, a form of divination and reality manipulation. Women who possessed this gift could predict the future, control the weather, and influence people's destinies. This aspect of religion and magic was also important in Viking cultural life, and is linked to their perception of the world as a place where gods and magic rule people. The myths of Thor, Odin, Freya, and other Viking deities reflected the most important values and beliefs of their people. These myths represented not only strength and courage, but also a deep commitment to fate, which they believed determines everything. Paganism and rituals such as sacrifices and the worship of sacred places were an integral part of Viking culture, defining their relationship with the spirit world and the forces that rule the universe. Today, although the Viking religion is a thing of the past, its traces remain in the culture, myths, and legends that continue to influence our perception of the Vikings. This legacy continues to inspire, revealing to us a world in which gods and men were inextricably linked, and every action could influence the fate of entire nations. The Vikings were not only famous warriors and conquerors, but also skilled craftsmen who achieved significant advances in technology and crafts. Their ability to create innovative designs, such as ships, as well as their mastery of blacksmithing and other crafts, played a key role in their successful campaigns, survival, and prosperity. The Vikings were masters of their craft, and their technology allowed them not only to overcome harsh natural conditions, but also to create unique products that still amaze contemporaries with their precision and perfection. The Vikings' most remarkable technological achievement was their ships, which allowed them to travel great distances, undertake long sea voyages, and successfully conduct military expeditions. These ships, known as drakars, were not just vehicles for transport, but also powerful weapons for conquest. Drakar construction was highly advanced and an example of Viking engineering genius. Drakari were boats with a long hull and a high bow, which was often decorated with carvings of dragons or other mythical creatures. Such ships were incredibly maneuverable and fast, which allowed the Vikings not only to quickly reach the coast, but also to easily maneuver in the water, even in conditions of strong storms and waves. Equipped with oars and sails, the drakar could move both in the wind and with the help of rowers, which allowed the Vikings to cover long distances, regardless of weather conditions. The unique design of these vessels included a lightweight but strong hull structure, which was made of timber using the slip plank technique. This made the drakar flexible and stable on the water, as well as easy to repair in the field. The ships were also light enough to be carried on land if necessary, and used as an invasion vessel deep into the continents. These features greatly increased the military power of the Vikings, allowing them to carry out swift, effective, and surprisingly accurate attacks. In addition, the design of the drakars included elements that provided them not only with maneuverability, but also protection from external threats. They were equipped with shields that were attached to the sides, which allowed the Vikings to defend themselves from arrows and other attacks during naval battles. Viking ships were so well thought out that they remained among the most efficient vessels of their time, and many of their design principles continued to be used in shipbuilding in the following centuries. The Vikings were masters not only in shipbuilding, but also in blacksmithing, jewelry making, and other crafts. Blacksmithing was the basis for the production of weapons that the Vikings used in their campaigns. Swords, axes, daggers, spears. All of this was created with high precision and attention to detail. Each weapon was not only a tool for battle, but also a symbol of social status. Viking smiths used a variety of methods to create weapons. One of the most famous methods they used was to smelt iron in large furnaces, which they then forged into swords and other weapons. The quality of the steel they produced was very high, and many Viking swords became legendary for their strength and sharpness. Swords with colorful, unique hilts, often decorated with precious stones or metal inlays, became symbols of their owner's status and power. But Viking blacksmiths did not limit themselves to making weapons. They also made various everyday items, such as knives, nails, tools, and even jewelry. Jewelry making was an important aspect of Viking art. Vikings used gold, silver, and other precious metals to create beautiful and functional items, such as bracelets, necklaces, rings, and earrings. Often, these pieces of jewelry had symbolic meanings related to religious beliefs, or were associated with an important event in the owner's life. Funeral decorations were especially important. The Vikings believed that after death, a person should be sent to the other world with dignity, and therefore often placed various jewelry, weapons, and symbols of power in the grave. These decorations, in addition to their aesthetic value, often had magical significance, protecting the soul of the deceased on its journey to the afterlife. Vikings, who lived in the harsh climate of Scandinavia, were masters of survival. The nature of these lands was difficult. Cold winters, strong storms, food shortages in the winter, all this required the Vikings to be able to adapt and use any available resources to survive. Their technology and skills helped them not only in battles, but also in everyday life. One such technology was food storage. The Vikings used a variety of methods to preserve food for the long winter months. This included curing and salting meats, as well as storing fish and dairy products in cold cellars. They also used the drying of berries and root vegetables, which allowed them to have food reserves during the coldest months when hunting and fishing became more difficult. Another example of survival technology was the construction of shelters. Vikings built their homes from wood, stone, and other natural materials. The typical Viking house was long and had a shape that helped retain heat in the harsh climate. The roof was often covered with turf, which helped retain heat in the winter. Such houses provided warmth and protection, even when the Vikings faced the harshest weather conditions. Another important technology was camp preparation. Vikings were masters of camp preparation and survival in the wild. Their military expeditions often passed through difficult-to-reach places, and to do this, they used the ability to quickly and efficiently set up camp, build shelters, and provide protection. In addition, their mastery of natural materials, such as wood, stone, and leather, allowed them to create the necessary equipment without depending on the resources available in each region. Thus, Viking technology encompassed not only weapons and shipbuilding, but also their ability to adapt to harsh natural conditions. These survival skills were no less important than military victories, and allowed them to overcome the difficulties they encountered on the way to their success. The craftsmanship and technology of the Vikings have left an indelible mark on history. Their ships, weapons, crafts, and survival skills were examples of remarkable technological advancement that allowed them not only to survive, but also to achieve great success in their campaigns and trading expeditions. The Vikings were not only fighters, but also craftsmen whose achievements in engineering and crafts may not have been appreciated in their time, but still amaze us with their ingenuity and ability to work with natural materials. The Vikings were not only traders, explorers, and craftsmen. Their conquests and expansion across Europe left a vivid mark on history, and although they began as small communities in Scandinavia, their influence spread over vast territories. The complexity of their expansion is that they not only conquered new lands, but also created their own states, which continued to develop for centuries after their conquests. The Vikings came to Europe as conquerors, but eventually became an important part of its cultural and political life. When we think of the Vikings, the first thing that comes to mind is their raids on the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, France, and other parts of Europe. However, in addition to the destruction they caused, the Vikings also created new political entities. One notable example is Normandy, a region in modern-day France that was founded by Vikings who became known as the Normans. In 911, the Viking Roland, or Rolf, became the first Norman duke when the King of France, Charles the Simple, gave him lands in Normandy in exchange for his loyalty. This event laid the foundation for the creation of one of the most powerful and influential kingdoms in Europe, which would go on to play a decisive role in shaping medieval Europe. The Normans, trained in warfare and seamanship, continued their conquests and soon became an important element of the European political scene. Thanks in large part to their influence, Normandy became a powerful empire in the 12th century, and its rulers would later conquer England. The Vikings also played an important role in the creation of Russia. The Vikings, called Varangians in Rus, founded the Rurik dynasty, which ruled the territory of ancient Rus for more than 700 years. According to legend, the Varangians arrived in the Slavic lands when the local tribes could not agree on a ruler. Rurik, one of the Viking leaders, was chosen as the ruler, and it was his descendants who founded Kiev on Rus. Thus, the Vikings became the founders of one of the largest and most influential states of the Middle Ages. One of the most famous and significant episodes in the history of the Vikings is their conquest of England. The Vikings began their campaigns in the British Isles in the late 8th century, when they began raiding monasteries and Anglo-Saxon settlements. These raids became increasingly organized, and soon the Vikings began to establish their rule on English soil. The most important event in the history of the Viking conquests in England occurred in 1066, when the Norman Duke William the Conqueror, a descendant of the Vikings, invaded England and defeated the Anglo-Saxon king Harold II at the Battle of Hastings. This event marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule in England and the beginning of the Norman dynasty. However, the important point is that the Normans were Vikings who, by conquering the Anglo-Saxon lands, became the basis for the formation of a new political order, as well as new cultural ties between Scandinavia, France, and England. The Vikings' conquests were not limited to attacks. They gradually settled in the conquered lands, creating new settlements, colonies, and trading centers. The Vikings brought with them their skills in construction, navigation, and agriculture, as well as their laws and traditions, which helped organize life in the new lands. The Vikings left a significant mark on the history of the Franks and Anglo-Saxons, not only as conquerors, but also as influential cultural and political forces. During the Carolingian and Frankish periods, the Vikings became important players in the political arena. During the 9th and 10th centuries, when the Vikings began to actively plunder France, they came into constant conflict with the kings of the Frankish state, which was already experiencing a crisis at that time. One of the most striking examples of Viking influence on the Franks is the Viking invasion of Paris in 845. At that time, the Vikings, led by Ragnar Lothbrok, captured Paris, an act that came as a shock to France. In response to the threat, the Frankish king Charles the Simple agreed to pay the Vikings a huge ransom. This episode not only demonstrated the power of the Vikings, but also their strategic importance as traders and potential allies, which was recognized in European political circles. After this event, the Vikings began to settle in parts of France. and their influence on the culture and politics of France became even more significant. Many of them, like the Normans, became important players in political affairs, and their military achievements were recognized not only during the reign of France, but also in its future. The Viking conquests ultimately not only changed the political map of Europe, but also left a deep mark on culture and social life. The Vikings brought with them their traditions, such as customs related to war, the role of family and leadership, and these elements influenced the structures of the new states. In addition, the Vikings played an important role in the development of trade between the East and the West. They paved the way for trade routes that connected Europe with Asian and Arab markets, as well as with the peoples of Scandinavia and Great Britain. The Vikings contributed to the spread of knowledge about new lands, goods, and technologies, which in turn had a significant impact on the further development of the economy and culture of medieval Europe. The Viking expansion was an important stage in the history of Europe, leaving not only traces of destruction, but also the foundations for new political entities such as Normandy and Rus. The Vikings not only conquered new territories, but also played a significant role in the creation and strengthening of new states, influencing the political, cultural, and economic processes of their time. Their presence in Europe became an important catalyst for further historical changes, creating a solid foundation for future transformations of the continent. Although the Viking Age is long gone, their legacy lives on in modern cultures and countries. Not only did the Vikings leave their mark on history as conquerors and explorers, but they also had a profound impact on the cultures, art, language, and even political structures of modern countries. Scandinavian countries such as Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland still retain elements of the Viking heritage that have influenced their development for centuries. Legends and myths about the Vikings, their culture, and their role in modern art and pop culture create a lasting interest in their historical and cultural legacy. In fact, even our language bears the imprint of their presence. The modern Scandinavian countries of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland, being the heirs of the great Viking kingdoms, largely retain the features and elements of their culture. The Vikings had a huge influence on the development of these countries, and many of their traditions and customs continue to live to this day. Norway, the birthplace of the Vikings, has not only preserved the memory of its historical role in the Viking Age, but also actively uses it as part of its national identity. Many archaeological finds, such as ancient burial sites, ships, and artifacts, tell of Norway's rich cultural heritage, and the Vikings still occupy an important place in the nation's mythology and art. The Vikings also played a key role in the formation of the early Norwegian monarchy, and many Viking runes, customs, and myths remain important in the country's cultural life to this day. Sweden, although largely subjugated by the Vikings in the early centuries, developed in its own right. However, the Viking influence has left its mark on Swedish culture and language. Various Viking festivals are still celebrated in Sweden, and their martial traditions and folk art remain an important part of the cultural heritage. Denmark is also one of the centers of Viking culture, and although it has undergone many changes since then, the Viking heritage is still alive. Denmark, like other Scandinavian countries, continues to explore its Viking history through archaeological research and cultural events such as Viking festivals, reenactments, and museum exhibitions. Iceland is perhaps the country most closely associated with the Vikings. Icelanders consider themselves direct descendants of the Vikings, and the island's culture still retains many features that were characteristic of the Viking Age. Icelanders are proud of their Viking roots and actively preserve them in their traditions and languages. Iceland has many Viking-related sites, including monuments, ancient sagas, and historical sites that still resonate in society today. Today, Vikings are not only a historical reality, but also an important element of pop culture. Legends of great heroes such as Ragnar Lothbrok, Valkyries, and gods such as Odin and Thor inspire many authors, filmmakers, and video game creators. Movies and TV series such as Vikings, 2013 to 2020, and Valhalla, the Viking Saga, 2022, bring the Viking myths to life, presenting them not only as brutal conquerors, but also as complex characters engaged in epic battles, political intrigue, and deep internal conflicts. These films and series often portray Vikings as people of high moral value, striving for personal honor and a spirit of brotherhood. Books, such as the Viking epics by authors such as Bernard Cornwell, provide deep historical research while recreating the lives and psychology of the Vikings. Viking books often combine fact and fiction to create compelling and dramatic tales that center on themes of survival, honor, betrayal, and fate. Video games, such as Assassin's Creed, Valhalla, and Total War. Thrones of Britannia also use Vikings as a key element of their stories, allowing players to immerse themselves in an era of great battles, pillaging, and exploration. These games portray Vikings as dynamic characters, actively involved in the struggle for power and territory. In addition to being entertaining, the games also help players gain a deeper understanding of aspects of Viking culture, including their beliefs, practices, and military traditions. Viking legends live on in other forms of art, such as theater, comics, and even modern music. Modern interpretations of these myths help us see the Vikings as multifaceted and complex characters whose stories continue to intrigue people today. Language is another area where the Vikings left a significant mark. Many modern languages, especially English, Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, retain words and expressions that originated with the Vikings and their cultural traditions. The English language contains many loanwords that trace their origins back to the Viking Age. For example, words like sky, window, husband, and they all come from Old English, which in turn was heavily influenced by Scandinavian languages due to the Viking conquests. The Vikings, as part of Anglo-Saxon culture, left their mark not only on politics but also on language, influencing many aspects of vocabulary and grammar. The Vikings also influenced the language in Iceland, where Old Icelandic, a direct descendant of Old Norse, continues to be spoken today. Icelanders are proud that their language still retains many ancient words and expressions that have not changed since the Viking Age. Some words related to their military culture have also survived in the languages. For example, words like battle, berserk, Viking, longship. All of them are closely related to this historical period. The legacy of the Vikings cannot be overstated. Their influence on modern Scandinavian countries remains important today, from cultural traditions to political structures. Viking legends live on in movies, books, games, and in our language. Their mythology, rich in myths and epics, continues to inspire generations. The Vikings were not only conquerors, but also cultural and trading brokers, whose achievements have left an indelible mark on history. The Viking Age may be long gone, but its spirit, cultures, and myths still influence our world, giving us inspiration and insight into how the past and present intertwine in the greater story of humanity. Viking society was not only martial, but also socially complex. Despite their reputation as brutal conquerors, the Vikings created a well-organized society in which each member had a place and role. Their lives were based on clear hierarchical structures, social ties, and traditions that ensured stability and survival in the harsh climate and frequent conflicts. The Vikings believed that their success in battle and trade depended not only on the strength of their weapons, but also on the social structure and organization of their society. The Vikings, despite their reputation as warriors, were also skilled farmers. Agriculture played a key role in their lives and economy, as survival in the harsh Scandinavian environment depended on the ability to grow food, raise livestock, and harvest crops. Viking agriculture was varied and involved several main activities. They grew barley, oats, and wheat, and they also farmed cattle, raising cows, sheep, goats, and horses. Viking agriculture was closely tied to the cycle of the seasons, with winter dependent on supplies and summer dependent on crops and livestock. This was the time when Vikings prepared for the winter months, stored food, and provided for their families. Vikings used sophisticated food preservation techniques, such as curing meat, salting fish, and drying grain, which allowed them to survive the harsh winters. One of the most important aspects of agriculture was the cultivation of the land. The Vikings cultivated the land using simple but effective tools, such as the plow and the sowing tool. These tools allowed them to cultivate the land efficiently, which resulted in good harvests despite the harsh climate. However, in addition to farming, the Vikings were actively engaged in fishing and hunting, which also allowed them to provide themselves with the necessary products and materials for trade. They not only caught fish for themselves, but also used it as an important commodity in trade with neighboring peoples. Thus, despite their warlike nature, The Vikings were skilled and hard-working farmers whose livelihoods depended largely on their ability to effectively manage the land and agriculture. This was not only an economic, but also a social obligation that supported the entire community and helped ensure its survival. Family ties played an important role in Viking society. The family was the basis of the social structure, and the social status of a Viking was often determined by his position in his family and clan. At the top of the social hierarchy were chieftains, princes, and kings who ruled over lands and people. Their power was based on military might, strategic alliances, and family ties. An important aspect of Viking power was that its legitimacy often depended on the strength and valor of the chieftain, who had to lead his people into battle and provide for their protection. Lower in the social pyramid were the princes, freemen, and peasants. Freemen had the right to land, could engage in trade, crafts, and participate in military campaigns. However, they were also obliged to follow the laws and support their clan. The Vikings had a strictly organized system of laws and rights that regulated relations between people and maintained order in society. It is important to note that, despite their high militancy, the Vikings valued justice and honor, which was reflected in their legal system. At the lowest level of the social hierarchy were the slaves, or trainers, who had no free will and were completely dependent on their masters. They did hard labor on farms, in homes, and in workshops. However, despite their low position, slaves could sometimes gain their freedom if they proved their loyalty and hard work. The Viking chieftain was not just a ruler, but also a symbol of strength and justice. The Vikings chose their chieftains based on their bravery, leadership qualities, and ability to lead men into battle. It is important to note that the Vikings did not choose their leaders by inheritance, as was the case in other cultures. The power of a Viking chieftain was confirmed not only by his pedigree, but also by his personal achievements. In addition, Vikings often held gatherings to discuss important issues such as wars, alliances, and laws. These gatherings could be formal or informal, and decisions were made that affected the entire community. Vikings believed in collective strength and made decisions in a spirit of democratic participation, where every free person had the right to express their opinion. Viking gatherings could be temporary or permanent. In some cases, Vikings gathered in things, popular assemblies where issues of local governance, land ownership, and law were decided. Things played an important role in establishing justice and in making decisions regarding war and peace. Rituals and symbolism also played an important role in the lives of the Vikings. For example, in some cases, the Vikings chose their leader through fate or incarnation in battle, where the winner became the new leader. However, the most important quality that was valued in leaders was not only physical strength, but also the ability to protect their people, lead them to victory, and ensure order in the community. Viking society was organized and multi-layered, with each person having a specific place. Vikings valued strength and courage, but justice, family, and community ties were also important. The Viking social structure was based on principles that allowed their society to survive and thrive in harsh conditions. Vikings not only engaged in military activities, but also built their lives around family values, social hierarchy, and respect for laws. The Vikings' family ties and culture, their ability to build social and political structures, made them successful, not only in battle, but also in their everyday lives. Their social and cultural traditions continue to inspire today, serving as an example of the importance of supporting one's community, following traditions, and maintaining honor and justice in difficult times. Viking medical practices were closely tied to their unique culture and living conditions. Although the Vikings did not have modern medical knowledge, their approach to treating illnesses and injuries was still quite advanced for their time. They used a variety of methods that combined traditional folk practices with religious and magical rites. Their medical practices were based on knowledge of herbs and plants, as well as beliefs that linked health with spiritual power and magic. The Vikings believed that illness could be a physical condition, or the result of evil spirits or the wrath of the gods. The Vikings, like many other peoples of that time, used herbs and plants to treat various ailments. This knowledge was often passed down from generation to generation, and the Vikings had extensive knowledge of the medicinal properties of plants that grew in Scandinavia. They used plants to create decoctions, infusions, ointments, and compresses that helped with illnesses, injuries, and also served to improve the general condition of the body. Some of the more famous plants used by the Vikings were: yarrow was used as a remedy for wounds and cuts. It had anti-inflammatory properties and was used for tissue healing. Melissa and mint were used to treat gastrointestinal diseases, improve digestion, and were also used to calm the nervous system. Succession was used for skin diseases and was also used as an antiseptic. Garlic. The Vikings used garlic as a remedy against infections and to boost immunity. Herbs and plants were an integral part of Viking medical practice. They used them to treat various ailments, as well as to prevent illnesses such as colds or skin infections. In addition to natural remedies, the Vikings actively used magic and runes to treat and protect against diseases. In their views, illness was often considered the result of evil spirits or curses, and treatment consisted not only of using herbs and decoctions, but also of magical rituals. Runes are symbols that the Vikings used not only for writing and communication, but also for magical purposes. Each rune had its own meaning and could be used for protection, healing, or as a talisman. The Vikings believed that runes could influence a person's physical and spiritual health. For example, the Fehu rune, symbol of abundance, could be used to attract health and luck, and the Jera rune, symbol of harvest, was used to heal ailments. Rune magic often involved spells that were spoken in times of illness. Healing with runes and magic words was common in Viking culture, especially among women and healers. Magical practices were also used to treat mental illnesses such as depression or anxiety, and in these cases, Vikings often resorted to ritual actions. In addition to herbs and runes, the Vikings used various tools for healing and surgery. For example, tweezers and pincers were used to remove arrows, thorns, or other foreign bodies from the body, which was especially important in conditions where fighters were injured during battles. Vikings also used blades and knives for more serious operations, such as amputations or cleaning wounds. Some archaeological finds show that Vikings were able to perform basic surgical care, although their medical knowledge was limited. For example, when dealing with broken bones, they used splints made of wood or other materials to support the broken body parts in a fixed position. Wound healing was also an important part of Viking medical practice. For this, they used natural ointments and balms, which were based on substances such as wax, oil, resins, and plants. The Vikings used various methods to disinfect wounds, although the concept of sterility was unfamiliar to them. However, their methods were often effective for their time. Women in Viking society often practiced healing, being the keepers of knowledge about herbs and healing practices. Women healers were usually responsible for preserving medical traditions and practices in their communities. Many were trained in the arts of herbalism, magic, and rituals that were passed down through generations. There are many references to female sorcerers and priestesses who used magic to cure illnesses or exorcise evil spirits. These women were often recognized figures in society, and their role was important in religious and medical practices. Women were also tasked with looking after the health of the family, which included not only cooking, but also treating illnesses and injuries. In some cases, women had to take on the role of leading healers in the community, especially when men were busy fighting or campaigning. The Vikings also had specific ideas about illness and death. For them, illness was often not just a physical condition, but the result of the intervention of spirits or evil forces. This idea of illness as a punishment from gods or spirits was an important aspect of their religious and medical practices. The Vikings believed that healing could not always be achieved through physical means alone. Sometimes they believed healing occurred through spiritual purification or through ritual sacrifice. Death and the afterlife were also important aspects of Viking life. Vikings believed in life after death, and for many, healing and preparation for death were integral parts of their cultural and religious traditions. Many rituals and burial practices, such as burial with weapons or jewelry, reflected the belief that the deceased would continue to exist in the afterlife, perhaps through power and magic. Viking medical practice was a unique blend of natural knowledge, magic, and spiritual beliefs. They used herbs, runes, and magical rituals to treat illnesses and injuries, and developed the basics of surgical practice. Their medical system was closely tied to their beliefs, and much of their medical knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. Despite the lack of modern knowledge of germs and infections, the Vikings were skilled healers, using all available natural and magical resources to keep their people healthy and alive. Viking architecture is not only an expression of their engineering and construction skills, but also an important element of their culture and a way of adapting to the harsh climatic conditions of Scandinavia. Viking construction was imbued with practical solutions that helped them survive in difficult natural conditions, as well as strengthen their defensive positions. The Vikings created buildings that served not only as shelter from the elements, but also as important social and cultural centers. The Vikings were excellent builders of fortresses and defensive structures that helped them survive and protect their settlements from enemies. Although the Vikings were primarily known for their campaigns and attacks on other countries, they also built powerful defensive structures in their territories that provided protection from enemy attacks. One such structure was the earthworks that the Vikings used to protect their settlements. The Vikings built high earthworks that surrounded their settlements, with deep ditches that made it difficult for enemies to advance. These fortifications often had wooden walls or fences that could be reinforced with stone or other materials. Earthworks were often used to protect against attack, especially in places where enemies could expect to easily reach the settlement. The Vikings also built wooden forts and walls to help them protect their settlements. One of the most famous examples of such constructions are the Viking forts in England. These wooden walls and fortifications were usually high and had small windows that were used to watch for enemies and for defense. In addition, the Vikings built watchtowers that served to warn of possible attacks. These towers allowed them to effectively control the territory and warn of approaching enemies. Inside the Viking settlements, there were often fences that served to separate the various social and economic parts of the settlement, such as houses, workshops, and places for animals. Viking rural architecture was incredibly functional, and building materials were often limited to what was available in their region. Vikings used wood, stone, and other natural materials to build homes and other structures. Wooden houses. The Vikings built longhouses, which were the main type of residential buildings. These houses, known as longhouses, were long buildings with one or more covered rooms that served as a place to live, store food, and provide protection from external threats. Inside the house, there was a common stove that served for heating, cooking, and lighting. These houses were built on a strong wooden frame, often with a roof made of turf or woven branches for additional insulation. Longhouses were often places where not only families lived, but also artisans, tradesmen, and servants. These houses were organized in such a way as to provide not only warmth and comfort, but also protection. Inside the house, there were several rooms for different needs, living areas for the family, places to store food, and workshops for processing materials. Viking religious buildings, such as temples and sanctuaries, were important centers of their cultural life. The Vikings worshipped many gods, and each of them had its own sanctuary. One of the most famous religious buildings was the temple dedicated to Odin in Uppsala, Sweden, where the Vikings performed their most important rituals and sacrifices. Temples' Viking houses were usually built of wood and decorated with carvings of gods and mythological creatures. These buildings had high roofs, often covered with metal or wooden tiles. They served not only for religious ceremonies, but also as centers for community meetings, where important issues such as war, peace, and law were decided. Vikings also built sacred forests and ritual sites, such as sacred oaks, which played an important role in religious life. These sites served as places for sacrificial rites to appease the gods and obtain their blessings for successful expeditions and harvests. One of the main features of Viking architecture was its adaptive quality. Vikings lived in harsh climates where temperatures often dropped below freezing in winter, and it was necessary to build buildings that could withstand the cold and snow. Therefore, they used wooden structures, which were effective in these conditions due to their thermal insulation and availability. Wooden frames allowed them to build houses that were easy to repair and strong enough to survive extreme weather conditions. The Vikings also used softwoods such as spruce and pine, which were not only affordable but also easy to work with. These materials provided sufficient strength and insulation. In addition, the Vikings used turf to cover their roofs, which also served as an additional protective layer. In winter, snow settling on the roof created natural insulation, helping to keep the heat inside. Viking architecture was not only practical, but also reflected their deep connection with nature, their ability to adapt to harsh conditions, and to provide security for their families and communities. Viking homes, fortresses, temples, and other buildings were designed with their needs in mind, and each structure was an important part of their culture and social structure. Viking building techniques became the basis for many architectural solutions in future generations and influenced the development of medieval architecture in Europe. Viking military strategies were a key factor in their success in conquest, and their approaches to warfare and defense had a profound impact on military tactics in the Middle Ages. The Vikings were not only skilled warriors, but also excellent strategists who used innovative methods of attack, defense, and planning. They adapted to different conditions, used their superior ships, and had a keen understanding of how to use force and maneuver in their warfare. Let's take a closer look at the military tactics and strategies that made the Vikings formidable opponents. One of the most famous Viking tactics was their ability to conduct lightning attacks. Vikings often used surprise and rapid attacks, especially in the early morning when their enemies were least prepared. These tactics allowed them to carry out unprovoked raids on coastal towns and settlements, making them very effective in the early stages of expansion. One of the most notable examples of such attacks was the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, which was one of the first known Viking raids on England. The Vikings unexpectedly arrived at the small monastery, looted it, and destroyed it, leaving behind piles of corpses and ruined buildings. This attack was the beginning of a long series of attacks by the Vikings on England, France, and other countries. The tactic of lightning attacks exploited flexibility and maneuverability. Vikings often attacked in places where the enemy did not expect an attack: monasteries, small villages, or along river routes. Their strategy was to quickly invade, loot, and retreat before the enemy could organize resistance. This gave them an advantage, as they remained elusive. One of the most powerful tools in the Vikings' military campaigns were their ships, the drakars. These fast and maneuverable vessels, with a high stern and bow, were designed to be not only transport, but also an effective weapon for attacks. Their main feature was that they could move not only on the sea but also on rivers, which allowed the Vikings to strike deep into territories not expected by traditional armies of the time. Drakari had a light construction that allowed them to move quickly through the water and build up speed, which was an important element for a quick attack. The ships were also used in battles. They could be used for naval battles or for maneuvers along the coast, where the Vikings could land their troops on land, attack, and immediately retreat, leaving the enemy in confusion. These ships were also used to capture ports and fortifications. During the attacks, the Vikings used shields and long spears to defend and attack. Importantly, the Vikings carried out attacks on land and at sea with their ships, making them warriors who were not dependent on one location, but could quickly adapt to different conditions. When the Vikings conquered new lands, their focus was not only on attacking, but also on defending their conquests. One of the most important elements of their strategy was the construction of fortresses and fortifications that protected their settlements from possible attacks. The Vikings built wooden walls and fortresses surrounded by high earthen ramparts and deep ditches. These fortifications were simple but effective, providing protection from attack. Fortresses such as Sharing in England were built to withstand sieges and attacks from enemies. These fortifications contained residential buildings, warehouses, and weapon workshops, allowing the defense to be maintained and the war to continue even under siege. In addition, the Vikings used border forts and watchtowers to monitor enemy movements and set up ambushes. It is important to note that the Vikings built their fortifications not only to protect themselves from external threats, but also to maintain power over the conquered territories. They often established small outposts and trading posts in the conquered areas, which allowed them to control local resources and trade routes. Viking armies typically consisted of infantry and horsemen, as well as archers and spearmen who used a variety of weapons. They were well organized and disciplined, which allowed them to be effective in battle. Berserkers. These are elite warriors who were known for their fierce bravery and frantic strength in battle. These warriors did not fear death and could fight in the most desperate conditions, which made them valuable in battle. Some researchers believe that berserkers could use certain rituals and magical practices to give themselves strength in battle. Shield bearers and spearmen formed the backbone of the Viking army, and each warrior was trained to fight using a variety of weapons, including swords, axes, and spears. The use of shields in combat was not only defensive, but also an offensive element, as the Vikings used shields to create strong defensive formations in battle. Viking battles often took place on open fields, using envelopment and flank tactics. Vikings were skilled at maneuvering their troops to create tactical advantages, and often used psychological elements of combat, such as intimidating shouts and demonstration attacks. Viking military strategies were extremely flexible, adaptable, and based on their unique capabilities in sea and land warfare. Not only did they attack with lightning speed, but they also skillfully used their technological advances, such as longships, to maneuver on water and land. Vikings not only conquered, but also defended their territories, building fortifications and using defensive tactics. These strategies ensured their victories in the most difficult and challenging conditions, allowing them to leave an indelible mark on the history of military tactics and strategy. The Vikings left us not only amazing examples of military valor, but also a wealth of myths and legends in which they became heroes. The images of such characters as Ragnar Lothbrok, Harold Bluetooth, Ivar the Boneless, and other great Vikings still live in culture and art. But, as often happens with heroes, reality and myth are intertwined, and it is important to separate historical truth from fiction. The Vikings were certainly outstanding figures of their time, but their lives and exploits often became part of the mythological fabric that adorned and enriched their legacy. One of the most famous Viking heroes is Ragnar Lothbrok, or Ragnar Lodbrok, a legendary Viking who became the central figure in several sagas and myths. Ragnar is presented as a hero who conquered vast lands, fought in great battles, and was known for his fearlessness and skill in military affairs. His life and exploits became part of Viking mythology and were widespread in the culture of the time. The myth of Ragnar, he is often described as a victor in numerous battles, a conqueror of France and England, but also as a man involved in personal dramas and family tragedies. One of the most famous myths about Ragnar is his fight with Ecgberht, the Anglo-Saxon king, and his capture of Paris in 845. However, the historical reality of Ragnar Lothbrok is questionable. Most sources that mention him are written in sagas and literary works, which often stylize his figure to convey moral lessons and heroism. Unlike historical chronicles, sagas often use elements of fiction that can greatly distort the real picture. Modern historians believe that Ragnar Lothbrok may have been a combination of several real Viking leaders, and his exploits may have been glossed over or embellished to create the image of a great hero. However, there is a possibility that Ragnar did exist, perhaps as one of the chieftains who fought in major military campaigns in the 9th century, and his name became a symbol of Viking glory and masculinity. Ivar the Boneless, another famous Viking who became an iconic figure in mythology. His name became synonymous with incredible tenacity, and his ferocity and bravery were often celebrated in songs and sagas. Ivar was one of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, and many epics are dedicated to his actions in the fight against the Anglo-Saxons and his role in the destruction of the kingdom. In the sagas, he is depicted as an outstanding warrior who, despite physical limitations, according to legends, Ivar had problems with his legs or they were damaged, continued to fight and lead Viking armies. The historical reality of Ivar the Boneless is also questionable. Many of the facts described in the sagas are not supported by documents and archaeological finds. However, historians believe that Ivar was a real person, possibly one of the Viking leaders who participated in raids and battles in England and France. His real role may have been less heroic and more political, and perhaps he was one of the Vikings who controlled certain territories or took part in diplomatic negotiations. Harold Bluetooth, or Harald the Forer, was a king of Denmark and Norway who became famous for his conflict with Christianity and the unification of Scandinavian territories. In myths, he is often depicted as an uncompromising leader who was hostile to Christian missionaries. History claims that he was the first Viking to accept Christianity, but according to legend, his fight against Christian missionaries was fierce. In fact, Harold Bluetooth is a historical figure, and his reign is confirmed by historical sources. But in many ways, the myth about him is distorted. For example, his title, Bluetooth, is related to the fact that in reality, he suffered from toothache, which may well be the source of his nickname. However, in the sagas and legends, his figure is often depicted as more majestic and symbolic, which creates an image of him as a symbol of resistance to the traditions of Christianity and the glory of the Vikings. As with Ragnar Lothbrok and other heroes, many Vikings became iconic figures in their own folk sagas and myths. These heroes were often idealized, their villainies exaggerated, and their successes in battle became legends that were told for centuries. A key element of these sagas was the transmission of history and values that helped strengthen the morale and spirit of the people. Vikings were seen as characters who could overcome all obstacles and achieve victory, which perfectly matched the image of heroism of the time. The Viking sagas and myths became an important part of their culture, with each name and deed intertwined with the eternal themes of honor, strength, loyalty, and revenge. These stories became part of history because they combined truth and fiction, and with their help, the Vikings could demonstrate not only their achievements, but also deep philosophical reflections on life and destiny. The myths of great Viking heroes such as Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, and Harold Bluetooth live on in the culture to this day. But it is important to remember that the reality of these heroes was often much more complex and less romanticized than depicted in the sagas and myths. The Vikings were certainly great warriors and strategists, but their figures have become part of popular mythology, in which stories of their victories and battles are sometimes embellished. Understanding where myth ends and history begins helps us better understand the Vikings as historical figures and appreciate their real impact on the development of European states and cultures. These myths live on in art, literature, and pop culture, reminding us of the great legacy of the Vikings and their unique role in European history. In recent decades, advances in genetics and DNA research have allowed us to study the origins of the Vikings, their migrations, and their influence on other peoples with greater precision. Modern genetic research is opening up new horizons in understanding how the Vikings spread across Europe and other parts of the world, and how their legacy lives on in modern peoples. By analyzing ancient DNA samples and comparing genetic data from modern populations, scientists have been able to draw some interesting conclusions about the origins and migrations of the Vikings. Vikings were mainly inhabitants of Scandinavia, including Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. Historically, it is believed that their ancestors came to these territories in the Stone Age and were descendants of various northern and eastern European peoples. When talking about the genetic composition of the Vikings, it is worth considering that their peoples were not uniform in origin, but rather represented a mixture of several peoples who came to Scandinavia in different historical eras. Modern genetic research confirms that ancient Scandinavians, including the Vikings, have close genetic ties to the Celtic, Germanic, and Balt peoples, as well as more distant groups such as the Finno-Ugric peoples. The genetic heritage of modern Vikings is quite diverse, and includes elements from different regions of Europe. One of the most interesting aspects that genetic research reveals is the migration of the Vikings and their influence on other peoples. The Vikings were active travelers, traders, and plunderers, and of course their activities left a significant genetic legacy in different parts of Europe and even in other parts of the world. England. Modern English DNA contains many traces of the Vikings. According to genetic studies, about 10% of the genes of modern British residents come from the Vikings, especially in the northern and eastern parts of England, where the Vikings had long established settlements. The genetic trace of the Vikings is also visible in Ireland, where the Vikings founded cities such as Dublin. Ireland. Research shows that the Vikings, in addition to plundering Ireland, also left a significant genetic legacy. The genetics of Irish people in the northern part of the country show signs of Viking blood, which is supported by historical sources about Viking settlements on the coast. France. Normandy, a region in modern-day France, was founded by the Normans, Vikings, who were granted the land by the French king in 911. The French, especially in the northern regions, are also thought to have significant Viking genes. The Normans, in turn, played a key role in the conquest of England in 1066, which also influenced the English genetic heritage. Iceland. Iceland is probably one of the most pure Viking territories, where the genetic heritage remains more obvious. Icelanders, according to genetic studies, are highly related to their Scandinavian ancestors, and their DNA contains traces of both Viking and more ancient Nordic peoples. This makes Iceland a unique place to study the genetic heritage of the Vikings. Russia and Eastern Europe. The Vikings also left a significant mark on Eastern European countries, especially Russia, where they played a key role in the formation of Kievan Rus. Genetic studies show that traces of Viking migrations can also be found among the inhabitants of Russia, especially in its northern and western regions. Genetic studies help to understand which modern peoples may consider themselves descendants of the Vikings, given their long-term migrations and integration into other cultures. Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians. As direct descendants of the Vikings, these peoples retain a high proportion of Viking genes in their genetic makeup. Moreover, their culture, language, and traditions still contain many elements that are characteristic of the Vikings. Irish and English. Despite the historical divide, many Irish and English people can claim Viking heritage. This is especially true in the northern regions of England and Ireland, where the Vikings left a significant influence. Icelanders. Icelanders are perhaps the most striking example of a people whose roots go back directly to the Viking Age. Iceland's language and culture preserve old Viking traditions, and genetic studies show that Icelanders still have a high percentage of Viking DNA. Normans, France. The Normans, after the Vikings settled in Normandy, continued to influence the development of the French people. Modern French people, especially in the northern regions, have a genetic heritage associated with the Vikings. With advances in genetics, scientists are able to trace the origins and migrations of the Vikings with increasing precision. Modern research uses not only DNA samples from ancient remains, but also genetic information from modern populations to identify genetic markers that may indicate Viking ancestry. One such tool is genetic testing of the Y chromosome, which allows us to examine the male line of ancestors, as this is the chromosome that is passed from father to son. Another important method is mitochondrial DNA analysis, which allows us to study the female line and helps to identify migrations of female groups. Modern genetic research opens up exciting prospects for understanding the historical role of the Vikings and their migrations. Although their actual origins and migrations are still partly a mystery, new data allows us to trace their paths, understand which peoples can consider themselves descendants of the Vikings, and how their genetic heritage influences modern populations. The Vikings left their mark not only on history and culture, but also on the genetic code of many peoples in Europe and North America. Viking religion played an important role in their lives and was an integral part of their culture. Vikings believed that their fates, as well as their success in battles, largely depended on the will of the gods, worship of gods, magic, rituals, and sacrifices. All these practices were important to the Vikings, as they sought to receive divine blessings for victories in battle, harvest, and prosperity. Vikings actively used religious rituals to strengthen their strength, protection, and victory. Their faith was closely connected with the natural world, ancestral spirits, and magical practices. One, the supreme god of the Vikings, was simultaneously the god of wisdom, war, and poetry. The Vikings believed that Odin guided the destinies of men and that he controlled the course of events on the battlefield. For the Vikings, Odin was a symbol of power and strength, but also wisdom. They believed that Odin could be both a helper in battle and a symbol of wisdom and guidance. He was a figure who, in his sacrifice and pursuit of knowledge, personified the importance of fighting for victory and striving for great goals. Thor, the son of Odin, was the god of thunder and lightning and the protector of the human world. The Vikings believed that Thor protected them from external threats, especially giant forces. His hammer, Mjolnir, was a symbol of strength and protection. Thor was the god the Vikings turned to for help in battle, praying for victory. Thor was both a god of physical strength and spiritual fortitude, and the Vikings often prayed to him before campaigns. Freya, the goddess of love and fertility, was also an important figure in the religious life of the Vikings. She was considered the goddess of magic and death, and held the key to life and the afterlife. Warriors who died in battle went to Valhalla, Odin's court, but some warriors also went to Folkvang, the place ruled by Freya. She was the goddess to whom one turned for protection and blessings on the warrior's path. Freya was also an important figure in the success of agriculture and fertility, which made her cult important in the peaceful life of the Vikings. Sacrifices were an integral part of Viking religious practice, as they believed that the gods needed sacrifices to grant protection, luck, and prosperity. Sacrifices took place not only in temples, but also in open spaces such as sacred forests or special ritual fields. Human sacrifices, Vikings rarely practiced this, but in some cases, such sacrifices were performed to strengthen ties with the gods and protect the community. Most often, Vikings sacrificed animals, horses, sheep, cows, dogs. These rituals were performed to appease the gods or to gain their support in war. Vikings believed that sacrifices were a way to show respect and willingness to serve their gods. A very important element in sacrifices was the blood sacrifice, the blood of animals or people, offered to the gods, symbolized life force. One of the most famous sacrifices is the famous sacrifice of 9 horses in Uppsala in Sweden, where the Vikings sacrificed animals in honor of the gods. Sacred forests also played an important role in religious practices. For example, sacred oaks, as a tree of strength and a symbol of life, often became objects of worship. In some places, the Vikings created sacred groves in which rituals and ceremonies dedicated to gods such as Odin and Thor took place. These places represented the connection between the world of people and the world of the gods. Viking rituals were usually strict and orderly. They were held in specially designated places, such as sacred fields where sacrifices were made, stones on which runes could be carved, and altars. Often, rituals included various elements of magic, such as sagd, a form of divination involving turning to the gods for help and predictions. One of the famous examples of sacred places is Uppsala in Sweden, where the main Viking temple dedicated to Odin and other gods was located. Here, the Vikings gathered to perform the most important religious rites and sacrifices. Viking sacred places were often located in forests or in secluded places, which symbolized the connection with nature and the divine world. Valhalla, Odin's court, where the best warriors who died in battle went, was the center of the most important religious beliefs. The Vikings believed that after death, valiant warriors were taken by the Valkyries, warrior maidens who served Freya and Odd, and taken to Valhalla, where they prepared for the great battle that predicted Ragnarok, the end of the world. This idea of life after death was important to the Vikings and symbolized their high value on the battlefield. Magic and witchcraft were an integral part of Viking religious practices. They used various types of magic, including seaid, a form of divination that included predictions of the future, spells for protection and healing, and magical rituals related to natural forces. Women, known as side madam or sorceresses, played an important role in these magical practices. They used runes, spells, and other magical practices to influence events in the world, be it campaigns, harvests, or battles. Viking magic was not only a practical tool, but also an important part of their spiritual life, because they believed that magic could change the course of fate and ensure victory on the battlefield. Viking religious practices were not just beliefs, but an integral part of their lives. The worship of gods, the use of magic and rituals to protect themselves in battle and to strengthen themselves, reflected the most important values of Viking society. Through sacrifices, sacred sites, and spiritual practices, Vikings sought the strength to win wars, preserve their lands, and ensure the well-being of their families and communities. These religious practices became the foundation of their culture and left an indelible mark on their legacy. The image of the Vikings has changed significantly from their heyday to the modern era. In the Middle Ages, they were depicted as cruel and barbaric invaders whose raids brought destruction and death. However, over time, this image has undergone a transformation. Today, Vikings are often depicted in modern art as heroes, adventurers, and cult figures. However, both in historical sources and in modern culture, Vikings remain the subject of many myths and stereotypes that paint their image in both positive and negative lights. In the Middle Ages, when the Vikings were actively raiding neighboring territories, their image in the eyes of the inhabitants of those countries was often distorted towards barbarity and violence. Historical chronicles such as Bede's History of England or the works of Frankish monks depict the Vikings as aggressive conquerors who attack Christian lands, plunder monasteries, and destroy civilization. These sources emphasize the barbarity of the Vikings, their rudeness and cruelty, pointing out their complete disrespect for Christian customs. For example, the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 was recorded as one of the first horrific Viking attacks on Christian holy sites, and this moment has often been portrayed as the beginning of the Viking Age. Such chronicles portray the Vikings as bloodthirsty invaders from the north who spared neither women, children, nor priests. Also in the Middle Ages, a myth was formed about the Vikings as wild northern barbarians who not only destroyed Christian culture, but also feared civilized people. These stereotypes were deeply rooted in the European consciousness, and the Vikings began to be associated with something alien, wild, and threatening. With the development of science and archaeology, as well as new historical research, the image of the Vikings has undergone significant changes. Today, Vikings are most often depicted as heroes, explorers, traders, and even legendary figures. Modern ideas about Vikings are very different from those that existed in the Middle Ages, and are often romanticized. In modern perception, Vikings have become symbols of courage, bravery, strength, and even freedom. One of the most famous and successful modern depictions of Vikings is the popular television series Vikings, 2013 to 2020, which focused on the life of Ragnar Lothbrok, one of the most famous Viking heroes. The series presented Vikings as complex, conflicted characters who sought greatness and power, but also sought personal freedom and new lands. This depiction of Vikings moved away from the stereotypes of brutal invaders and instead focused on the more human aspects of their lives: love, betrayal, the desire for justice and power. Another example is the film How to Train Your Dragon, 2010, which depicts Vikings as part of a friendly and peaceful community that strives to establish a relationship with dragons. In this film, Vikings are not shown as destructive, but as people capable of change and harmony with nature. In literature, the image of the Vikings has also undergone significant changes. Novelist, writer, and historian Bernard Cornwell, in his cycle of historical novels Ragnar's Saga and Viking, depicts the Vikings as realistic and multi-layered characters. In his works, the Vikings are not only fierce warriors, but also people with feelings, experiences, striving for a great goal, and struggling with internal conflicts. Modern fantasy also often uses elements of Viking mythology. For example, in George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire trilogy, which was also influenced by Scandinavian myths and Viking culture, we see elements such as powerful kings, cult figures, magic, battles, and mythology similar to what was typical for the Vikings. In video games, the image of Vikings has also become an important element of pop culture. Games such as Assassin's Creed, Valhalla, For Honor, and Total War. Thrones of Britannia allow players to immerse themselves in the world of the Vikings, where they become part of their stories, battles, and political intrigues. These games depict Vikings as great warriors, explorers, and conquerors who play an important role in shaping historical events. In Assassin's Creed, Valhalla, the Vikings are presented as aggressive, but also culturally and historically complex characters, striving not only to conquer new territories, but also to build a new society, which certainly reflects a more romanticized perception of their image. The image of the Vikings is often surrounded by myths and stereotypes. One of the most persistent myths is the idea of the Vikings as uncivilized barbarians, whose attacks were aimed solely at destruction and plunder. This perception largely grew out of medieval sources that focused on the destruction and violence caused by the Vikings. However, modern research shows that the Vikings were not only conquerors, but also traders, craftsmen, and explorers. They established complex trade routes that connected Scandinavia with Eastern Europe, the Arab world, and even North America. The Vikings also actively participated in cultural exchange, borrowed much knowledge from other peoples, and influenced the development of the civilizations with which they came into contact. Another common myth is the image of the Vikings as invincible warriors who always won battles and fights. Although they were indeed outstanding fighters, their defeats and difficulties in maintaining their conquests were also part of their history. The myth of invincibility greatly enhances the romantic component of their image, but does not reflect the full complexity of their lives and struggles. The image of the Vikings has changed significantly from ancient times to the modern era. From brutal invaders and barbarians who personified destruction, the Vikings have become heroes, cultural and historical figures who inspire study and admiration. Modern films, books, and video games present them as multi-layered and complex individuals, while myths and stereotypes continue to fuel our perception of them as strong and invincible warriors. It is important to understand that the Vikings were not only conquerors, but also people who left an important mark on the history of Europe and the world as a whole. The Vikings, despite their reputation as brutal warriors and conquerors, had a highly organized legal system that helped maintain order in their societies and resolve issues ranging from land ownership to marriage and inheritance. These laws and traditions were an important part of the Vikings' social structure and culture, and they were often fairer and more effective than is commonly believed. Especially important in their legal system were the popular assemblies that decided the most important issues in the life of the Viking communities. Ting or ting was the primary institution for decision-making and legal proceedings in Viking societies. Things were held on a regular basis, and every free man could take part in them. These meetings served both to hear legal disputes and to discuss more general issues such as war, peace, and laws. Many important issues were decided at the things, such as land ownership, marriage agreements, and inheritance decisions. They were open meetings where participants could express their opinions and where important decisions were made collectively. Such meetings, unlike court proceedings, were highly democratic, and although leading members of society were present, their decisions relied heavily on general agreement. The Vikings had their own laws that regulated almost all aspects of their lives. These laws were not based on written codes, but on oral traditions that were passed down from one generation to another. These laws, despite the lack of written documents, were based on the principles of justice and public agreement. The Vikings used their judicial process to resolve issues between people, avoid violence, and maintain order in society. Land ownership was a major issue for the Vikings, and most conflicts and disputes were related to land rights. The Vikings had strict rules regarding land ownership. Land was usually passed down from father to son. However, if there were no heirs in the family, it could be given to a close relative or sold at a thing. Conflicts over land could be resolved at a ting with the participation of chieftains and other members of the community. The decision-making process on such issues was quite formalized, and decisions were made not only on the basis of laws, but also on the basis of public opinion. Viking marriages were governed by both family traditions and legal norms. For example, Vikings often used written contracts to conclude marriages, which stipulated the obligations of the parties. For example, the husband had to provide protection for the wife, and the wife had to take care of the house and children. These contracts also regulated issues of inheritance, which in the event of the death of one of the spouses was transferred in a certain order, most often to the children. Inheritance was also strictly regulated. In the event of the death of the head of the family, his property was transferred according to established laws, which, in turn, depended on the status and position of the person in society. The Vikings considered honor and family ties to be the most important aspects, and legal norms regarding inheritance were aimed at strengthening family ties and preserving wealth within the family. The Vikings used a legal system to regulate crimes such as theft, murder, and even treason. Crimes such as murder were meted out with harsh punishments, including monetary fines or expulsion from the community. Blood feuds were an accepted practice in some cases, but the Vikings generally preferred to resolve such conflicts in a more formal setting through things to prevent violence. One interesting aspect of the Viking legal system was that punishments were usually public. The Vikings used public trials where the guilty could appear before their community and accept punishment. This helped to create collective responsibility for the behavior of each member of society. In Viking society, chieftains and judges played an important role in justice. Chieftains often acted as the main judges who took part in trials and made decisions, but they also took into account the opinion of the community and traditional norms. It is important to note that judges at the things could be not only men, but also women, which makes the Viking system relatively progressive for that time. Women could be witnesses and participants in trials, and also have a voice in deciding the most important issues for the community. The Viking legal system influenced the legal traditions of the countries with which they interacted. For example, Norman law, which later formed the basis of some legal systems in Europe, was largely borrowed from Viking laws. In Normandy, the Vikings created their own legal state, which later influenced the legislation of France and other European countries. The Viking legal system was a vital part of their social structure and culture. Despite their reputation as barbarians and brutal conquerors, the Vikings had a complex and effective system of laws and court procedures that helped them maintain order in society and resolve important issues such as land ownership, inheritance, marriage, and crime. The Vikings proved that even in the conditions of war and the brutal struggle for survival, they were able to create a system in which the observance of laws and justice played a key role in the successful life of their communities.